Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's somewhat remarkable statement at the weekend that he is comfortable triggering a recession. An interesting statement for a Chancellor to make at any time, but to do so when already far behind in the polls and just before a general election is, I think, probably unprecedented. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So there was a serious risk of the UK being in recession at this point. We avoided it, although our economy has still shrunk. A recession, remember, is just a technical term for an economy shrinking for 2 consecutive quarters. So, you know, it's possible for an economy to grow in a particular. You might have a recession, you shrink in 2 quarters by, say, about 0.1% or something like that. Then you have a big growth spurt. So overall, the economy has grown, and yet you had a recession in it. And it's equally possible to avoid a recession, but your economy still shrinks overall in that year. You might have minus 0.3% growth, then plus 0.1% growth, minus 0.3% again, and plus 0.1%. No recession, and yet your economy has still contracted over the year. So I generally find the obsession amongst the media with recession a little bit weird. Just like the media might paint a picture of doom and gloom if our economy shrinks by, say, 0.1%, but then puts a positive spin on it if it grows by 0.1%, even though they're basically the same thing, zero growth, a stagnant economy. But recession is a loaded term. It's politically loaded as well. Whether it should be or not is another matter. But if the media reports that the UK is in recession, the party of government at that time, regardless of what's going on, will find themselves suffering reputational damage. As far as most of the public are concerned, recession is a catastrophe, and that's all there is to it. So why on earth would Jeremy Hunt say he's comfortable with the UK going into recession in 2024, the year of the general election? Well, he says that it's worth it to get inflation down. Now, I did see some polling recently, and it's a position that technically has public support. The public sort of seem to think if it's a choice between recession and high inflation, well, they'd rather have the recession and not high inflation. And that's probably because a lot of people sort of see that recession doesn't really affect them in reality. You know, inflation does, though. Inflation affects everyone. And I say recession doesn't affect anyone because that's because recession is a symptom. It doesn't directly do anything to you. It might indirectly. But it is a symptom, not a cause of anything. If the economy contracts for 2 quarters in a row, we're in a recession. But being in recession doesn't in itself do anything. It's just the outward sign of businesses making less money. But because some businesses would go bust if they made less money, that also means job losses. It would certainly mean pay restraint from businesses which could get by but would need to tighten their belts. Or even just businesses using the contraction as an excuse to cut pay increases. After all, if unemployment goes up, significantly especially, then the job market tilts in favour of the employer and they can afford to suppress wages with a lower risk of losing staff. So when Hunt says he's comfortable risking a recession, what he's really saying is that he is comfortable allowing the conditions whereby the economy shrinks, resulting in businesses going under, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes and incomes being kept down, which would all, of course, lead to lower consumer confidence and further economic stagnation. You know, the Chancellor of a government which has made growing the economy one of its 5 pledges has basically said that he supports moves to shrink the economy. The other thing to consider is why are we suddenly having all this talk of a recession again anyway? Like, if it happens, it probably wouldn't happen for another year. So what is the cause of it all? Especially as this time last year, we were worried about a recession towards the end of last year. It didn't happen. Is this the same sort of thing? Well, last year, the Bank of England said that interest rates rising to 5% would be round about a cliff edge. That would be, at that point, you start to see significant numbers of, say, defaults on loans like mortgages. This is the point at which economists think we would reach a tipping point, which would send the country towards recession. Now, a year ago, the base rate was 1%, and that already represents the highest interest rates in over a decade, ever since the banking crisis, really. But since then, it has been rising, and it now sits at 4.5%. The reason why talk of recession is coming back is essentially down to two factors. So first, the interest rate is now approaching that 5% potential tipping point that was feared last year. Second, because inflation is not falling as quickly as expected, the Bank of England is going to keep increasing interest rates. In fact, core inflation is actually increasing. Core inflation is the inflation without food and energy included. Now, the fact that the Bank of England are even being encouraged by the government to raise interest rates to tackle inflation, when the inflationary problems we have at the moment are mostly related to what is basically war profiteering and supply issues, not excessive demand, is annoying more than a few economists. But never mind that most economists think that central banks around the world, it's not just ours, are wrong to be raising interest rates in response to the particular type of inflation we have. The fact is they are doing so. And because inflation is not coming down as quickly as expected, our central bank is going to carry on raising interest rates. So people are now talking about the potential for interest rates to rise to 6%. Well, if about 5% is considered roughly where the tipping point is, then 6% is surely over it. And as a little aside, so there may be some who wonder, so why are these interest rates such a problem when we've had interest rates that high and higher a couple of decades ago when everything seemed to be fine, when the economy was doing well? Well, the issue is it's the debt onto which the interest is being added. See, mortgages, for example, are way higher than they used to be. The average house price is now 9 times average earnings. It used to be about 5 or 6 times when interest rates were the last time they were this high. So these interest rates are being added onto proportionally much higher debts. And 6% on a massive debt is way harder to afford than 6% on a modest debt. And especially when the finances have been organised based on the idea of a base rate that was just over 0% and has suddenly blown up to 4.5% in the space of a year and may basically get up to 6%. Also consider that average incomes have been kept below inflation generally while the Tories have been in office, and that is why climbing interest rates are a particular problem. But getting back to why the government would want to encourage the Bank of England to risk triggering a recession, there are probably one of two reasons. The first is that they think that inflation will cause them a bigger political headache than a recession. After all, if we find ourselves in a recession, it means people will have lost their jobs. But most people will still have them. Even in a recession, the vast majority of people keep their jobs. If inflation has dropped down, then what it means is that most people will find the cost of living easing as long as their income is going to go above inflation. If that inflation comes down to the point where their pay rises can meet it, it feels like the cost of living is getting better. And this will only happen when inflation is basically back down to 1 or 2%. So you can see why the Tories would be desperate to get it back down to there. So even if it means, they don't mind sacrificing anyone, do they? Even if it means sacrificing a few percent of the working population for everyone else to feel that actually the cost of living is easing. The second possibility, as I see it, is the usual Tory belief in fairies and unicorns. Sunak promised to halve inflation this year. It is the only one of his 5 pledges that had a definite time frame. As such, he must meet it or he will be seen to have failed. See, with the other pledges, he can always claim it's a work in progress because he didn't actually say when it would be achieved, did he? You assume by the election, but he didn't say that. And then they may also imagine that even encouraging the conditions for recession doesn't mean a recession will definitely happen. So they may be chancing their arm a little bit, prioritising inflation in the hope that they also get away with the recession by pure chance. After all, they did half a year ago. Being a Tory in government is, generally speaking, largely a gamble that things will work out because they don't do any actual governing. However, for my final point, I think I must go back to what a number of economists think about this general strategy. If raising interest rates is not actually directly dealing with the particular inflationary pressures that we're experiencing, which includes Brexit impacts, remember, and the government aren't doing anything about those inflationary pressures, then there's a decent chance that not only do we enter recession at some point next year, but that we don't even get the inflation down to the desirable level. You know, the Tories here are basically playing a game of pitch and toss. They're hoping they get both wins, but they could easily end up getting both losses. Then how many MPs will they be left with come the election? High inflation and a recession. Lovely. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. Well, until next time, I'll see you later.